Welcome everybody. Today we have an action-packed session. This is the place to be because we're going international now. We are going to join Scott Nicholson, who is a professor of game design, who's joining us today from Ontario, Canada, where it is the morning, I believe. So I will hand over to you, Scott. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and share what I've been working on over the last year. I've been on sabbatical from my university and I've been working on this new project, and I'm going to be sharing some of the results with you now. So today what we're going to talk about is a game system I created to address some issues that I saw with accessibility in games and classrooms. I will give you a little demonstration of it. I'll talk about how to create any kind of narrative educational game, and then I'm going to point you to some resources if you want to continue this process of making games. And this system is called EscapeIF, and I'll talk about why shortly. So escape rooms, if you've not been to an escape room, the idea is that it's a live action game where you work together as a team to hunt down clues and solve puzzles and accomplish tasks in one or more rooms to try and accomplish a goal. Usually that goal is escaping from the room, but not always. And you have a time limit. And escape rooms, I got involved with them in 2014. I was in Singapore and saw them there and said, well, this is exciting because I've been involved in live action role-playing games all of my life. And I saw, hey, they've figured out a way to monetize live action role-playing games. I'm going to get involved with this. So I was the first researcher to do a big study about escape rooms internationally and really got involved with creating them. And escape games are games that use concepts from escape rooms. Now, usually in our classrooms, we don't have the ability to build out big fancy escape rooms. Some places do. This Education Immersion Center in Venezuela. What they do is they take this is their classroom that they use for the entire year. They create a narrative that runs the course of the entire academic year. The students in this year, it was science fiction themed, and the students were flying a spaceship around and then doing different things. And so throughout the course of the year, all of their course topics were built into this one narrative. So you can, if you think about that, you could think about how you could create communications activities like writing and reading. You could create science activities where you go to a planet. You could create math activities where you're trying to fix the ship. And everything was built into this world. And that's fantastic, but most of us cannot do this for sure. But perhaps later on, we'll talk about how you can. Now, I wrote a book with Liz Cable, and we wrote this book that came out last year on unlocking the potential of puzzle-based learning. And what we did is we created different game shapes because we realized most teachers can't make escape rooms in their classroom, but they can make different kinds of escape games. So we talked about some of these shapes like pop-up escape rooms where you bring in the puzzles and challenges into the classroom for just a short period of time, or a puzzle hunt where you have packets of paper and those packets have puzzles on them. And the idea is that students are in teams at a table, they're working through a series of puzzles, and then as they solve the puzzles, they get a password or a code word to then take to the teacher then gives them the next packet of puzzles and they continue on. Or breakout EDU or breakout boxes, which you might have heard of. Breakout EDU made these very popular. The idea is that you have a box with a series of locks and you put all that together and each group has their own copy of boxes and locks. And while it's great to simulate that, the reality is you get a lot of kit if you're doing this. You end up with a lot of junk everywhere. And so, but this book I'll point you to if you want to explore these different game shapes and different ways to bring escape games into your classroom. But I was challenged by the M-Education Alliance when I was talking about this. Now, the M-Education Alliance is a group out of the US that works with low resource classrooms around the world. And they said, well, Scott, here are the sort of classrooms we support. These are classrooms where the only technology that we have is a blackboard, that we could have found objects, but we don't even have disposable paper. So you can't go and do like a puzzle hunt where you make a bunch of copies of paper. Now, our traditional solution to this is let's bring in tablets and drop a bunch of technology in there. And I said, you know, there's a better way to do this. And so their challenge to me was, could I come up with a way of doing escape games in a low resource classroom? And I said, that's a really interesting challenge. And that was my entire goal of my sabbatical over the last year, is to come up with a way to do this. And I did. I came up with something called EscapeIF. Now, what EscapeIF does is that combines a lot of different storytelling game systems that we've used in the past and brings it all together. Concepts of tabletop role-playing games where there's a game master who tells the story and the players say back to them what they want to do. concepts of interactive fiction games. So those are where, like the old games like Zork, where it would say there's a mailbox here. What do you want to do? Concepts from the Choose Your Own Adventure book series, where you have a bit of narrative and it says, if you want to go left, turn to page 27. If you want to go right, turn to page 28. Concepts from something called Parsley games, which took ideas from interactive fiction, but then put them into a party game type setting where one player ended up being the computer and would say to everyone, all right, there's a mailbox here. What do you want to do? And points to someone and that person says what they want to do. And even I saw we did podcasts. There's a podcast called Escape the Podcast, which takes an escape room and does it completely in audio form. You can even do that through your portable devices. I'm not going to say her name because I have one sitting right here and she's going to talk if I say her name. But if you ask her to play an escape room, you can actually play an online escape room through just voice. So I took all these combinations and I said, what if we create the situation where the teacher is playing the role of the computer and the blackboard is like the computer screen. And the players are all working together to solve an interactive fiction style game where the teacher is using the blackboard to record the state of what's going on. So the teacher's going to put everything on the blackboard. And that's at the heart of what's going on with EscapeIF. Now I'm going to run you through 2 sample activities, the 2 core activities, choices and challenges. I'm going to run you through one of each right now, just so you have an idea of what we're talking about. So first, here is a problem. So I always like to set my games in a story world, which we'll talk about later. And the idea of the story world is it allows the players to get immersed in the game. It allows you to connect everything together and to put your learning outcomes within real world activities. So the story world that I'm using here is the dinosaur safari. You're all working at the dinosaur safari. And you've got these dinosaurs, their pen is damaged. And now what you know about the dinosaurs is you know that they are the D-longs. They're about 5 feet long. They weigh about 15 pounds. They're like baby Tyrannosauruses, so they're nasty, but they're smaller, but they do have very sharp claws and teeth. Now, you're going to have to make a holding pen, and your first choice is, do you want to make that holding pen out of wood or out of metal? Now, if you make it out of wood, it can be taller. It could be 10 meters tall. But if you make it out of metal, it's going to be shorter, but it's going to be stronger. So now in the chat, I want you to vote whether you want to make this pen out of wood or metal. Please type in the chat wood or metal now based upon what you would like to do. Now in a class, this choice, the way I would do this choice is I would provide the narrative. I would then ask the students to raise their hand for wood, raise their hand for metal. Sometimes what I'll do is if I feel that people are going to look at what other people are saying, I would say, I want you to close your eyes and D-longs, no, they cannot jump high. So I would ask the students to close their eyes and vote if I didn't want them to have an influence on each other's votes. Now, what I also could do with a choice is I could put the students in small groups and say, I'm going to give you 1 minute to talk about it, and then everyone will vote individually. So with choices, you can either have an immediate vote for a choice, or you can have everyone vote for a choice. Everyone talk first and then vote. So I see more people have said metal than wood. So in the script that I have, it would say, if the students choose metal, go to paragraph 7. And then I would go to paragraph 7 and continue reading. And that choice would have an implication later on in the game. So that is one of the activities in EscapeIF is a choice. Now the other activity is a challenge, and we're going to do a challenge right now. Hopefully you have some memory of math for this. We are going to put you in small groups. So the idea here is now this game is based on math learning outcomes. We're looking at concepts of perimeter and area. Now, as a reminder, to calculate the perimeter of something, you add up the length of all the sides. So if you have a rectangle and you want to figure out the perimeter, you add up the length of the 4 sides. If you want to calculate the area of a rectangle, you're going to multiply the length times the width of that rectangle. Those are the 2 things you need to remember. Now, the D-longs, each D-long needs 1 square meter of space. The challenge here is that you've got 24 meters of fencing to make a pen, and you need to figure out the pen size that will hold the most number of D-longs. Now, I'm going to put you in breakout groups. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. My suggestion is how to solve this is try it out. Figure out a pen that uses 24 meters, calculate the area. Then try another shape of pen, calculate the area. So you're going to have 5 minutes to come up with the pen that will hold the most D-longs. So I'm going to throw you in, I'm going to throw you in rooms now, and we're going to go there, and we're going to go into breakout rooms. And we're going to create, oh, how many people do we have? I need to know how many rooms. I'm just going to pick a number.
Yeah, 41 in total.
Okay, so we're going to make 10 breakout rooms then. And we're going to go. And we're going to open all rooms. So you're going to have 5 minutes to solve this puzzle. One minute left.
Being recorded.
Okay, I think everyone's coming back in now. So in the chat, I would now like you to type, what was your best pen and how many D-longs could it hold? So some people figured out a 6x6. Look at all you math wizards out there. So what we would do now in class is we would go into a reflection where we would talk about why did the 6x6 pen hold the most? What rule of thumb might that guide you to think about how to most effectively use material? And the idea here is that what we're trying to do is create a real life application of a learning outcome and doing it in a narrative setting. So these, yes, that actually, the circle would be the next question to say, okay, what if we're not using rectangles? What is a circle? How large, how many can you put in a circle? Because that creates an interesting, what if you're able to go 3D? You can think about that, you know, so this is where you can continue to explore this narrative world. But the idea here is that we're taking a storytelling game. You've had now these are the two main building blocks, choices and challenges. And you can see how between alternating between choices and challenges and narrative, you can have an activity the whole class is working together on rather than competing against each other. So you're working as a large group to solve the puzzles, solve the challenges. You're giving the player some agency, but you're able to tell stories that create opportunities to explore learning outcomes in real world settings. So the name EscapeIF comes from escape for escape room concepts and if for interactive fiction. And it's all based around learning outcomes and bringing in real world applications of the learning outcomes. Now, the way that this game is facilitated and what's available to you right now for free at escapeif.com are scripts, game scripts. You see on the screen, this is what the game scripts look like. It tells the teacher what to read. You're working at a dinosaur safari, and et cetera, et cetera. So you read it out loud. What should we use? A wood fence or a metal fence? If we use a wood fence, go to entry 2. And then you write on the board wood fence, because that is how you're recording the state of something in the game, is you put that on the board. So later on, you can refer to it and said, okay, there's a wood fence. Now we have a big storm. Let's talk about the implications of that storm. Let's talk about the implications of your choices. So these scripts are now available. You can, we've got 4 sample games so far, and we're looking to get more. We're going to talk about how you make these shortly. Same thing with the challenges. They're written out. You've got the math. In this case, they're math problems. So you write out what the teacher writes out on the board and what they say, and you let the students explore it. So all these are available. So the benefits of the EscapeIF system is from an accessibility standpoint. This is what bothers me about many people focus on learning games, and they are only focusing on digital learning games. Well, that cuts out huge numbers of classrooms around the world who don't have access to the technology. And they're not going to be dealing with, you know, upgrades and updates and all of that. And oh, our operating system doesn't work, and we don't have the iPads, and we don't have the tech. We don't need any of that. It's a script, and the teacher's reading that script. Now, if you have resources, you can enhance it. I could play music on the speakers. I could add resources, but we're putting everything, all of this, by the way, is all in the Creative Commons. It's all available for free. The system, the creation tools, the worksheets, it's all free and available, and we want you to help us create more. The other nice thing is because the teacher is making the reality come to life as they say the words, the teacher can change anything about the game at the moment of game. So if dinosaurs didn't work for my classroom, it could be goats, it could be robots, it could be whatever. If that problem is too easy or too hard, the teacher can just change it. If they want to allow circles, they can change it. It takes out that you don't have a board game that's set. You don't have a digital game that's set. The teacher has the ability to change the game as they need to for their classroom. There's nothing that's locked in place. And because people are working together, they're together at the same problem at the same time. If you make a competitive escape game, you're going to find people race really fast and they don't think about what they're doing. But if the teacher's controlling the pace of the game and the pace of the reflections between the challenges, then you know everyone's going to be together exploring things at the same time. You have the students discussing in small groups, but they vote separately, so they all get a voice. And then you have reflections. So the 3 things you're doing are choices, challenges, and reflections to have the students think about what they're doing. Where we're going with this project is, so if escapeif.com, that will take you to what you see here, a number of sample games. You're going to find worksheets and creation guides. You're going to find some online videos that I've made. And we're continuing to partner with the M Education Alliance, who is hosting a repository. So if you create an EscapeIF game, you can submit it to the Education Alliance, and then that will be shared out with other people. And that's our goal now, is we're moving from me making games for teachers to helping teachers make games, and more excitingly for me, helping students make games. We'll talk about that. So we're going to spend the rest of the time giving you a brief overview of how you make a game. So this is now how you make really any narrative educational game, not just what we're talking about here, that it's a process of planning and developing and testing, but it's an iterative process. So you'll start to plan, start to develop, then go back to planning, then you test something, then back to develop. So understand that it's not a one pass through, but it's an iterative process. What I don't want you to make is this nonsense. So these are awful puzzle-based games where there's no application of what you've been doing to the real world. You know, we don't want to make quizzes with volcanoes. So this is not a goal of making, and that's a problem I've seen with many escape rooms that are made for classrooms right now, is they're basically quizzes where you use a lock to grade the quiz. And that wastes so much of the availability of a narrative-based game. So we don't want to create this type of game. Instead, we want to look at games that apply the real world to the learning outcomes. So examples of that from the past would be like Lemonade Stand game, where you're using economic concepts. Reigns, where you're making historical decisions and seeing the implication. A news writing game, where you're actually doing journalism by writing stories. So we're trying to look for how do we either have a real world application of what we're doing, or some kind of fantasy or historical setting that we can play with to apply the real world. So here's the overall process. Now I'm presenting this at a super high level. I'm going to point you to at the end, there's a 2-hour video which takes you through this whole process in depth. And there's a worksheet available. There's the link for that, tinyurl.com/escapeif worksheets, or just go to escapeif.com. You can find all the resources there. So we're going to talk about these major steps: figuring out your learning outcomes, developing a story world, creating a narrative arc, creating a challenge for each story beat, add some choices, and then add a reflection. These are the steps you use in any narrative-based educational game. We're going to be applying them to EscapeIF here. So first, the learning outcome. You start with the learning outcomes. Don't start with puzzles. Start with what are we trying to teach? The Global Proficiency Framework, if you haven't heard of it, is a tool that's useful if you're working in math or literacy, because it takes learning outcomes and breaks them down into multiple individual levels. And the idea is that this Global Proficiency Framework is now a crosswalking series of learning outcomes between different learning outcomes in different settings. So if you don't know about this, take a look at it. I found this really useful as a designer because it helped me to brainstorm my puzzles. It helped me to say, oh, okay, I can make this kind of puzzle because this learning outcome is broken down in these ways. So the Global Proficiency Framework from UNESCO is a really useful tool in developing either math or literacy games, but you can make games with any topic using this system. But the best concept is the learning outcomes need to have a real world outcome. If there's not a real world application for the learning outcome, don't bother with EscapeIF. Use another way to teach your students, because EscapeIF is best when you have a real world application of the learning outcome. So when you think about the story world, then you want to brainstorm what's the real world setting where the learning outcome would be used. So like if you're teaching math or teaching perimeter and area, well, building fences. Okay, that's fine. I made a game about a teacher wanted a game about fractions. I'm like, all right, what could we do? Now I like using the Dinosaur Safari story world for all my games because there's a lot of different applications from that. I remember how we looked at that Venezuela spaceship and you said, that's really cool, I can't do that. Well, you can from a storytelling perspective. If my whole semester was all set in a Dinosaur Safari in narrative storytelling world, I get all those advantages without having to have all the technology. And because the students then get involved, they begin to take on their roles, and then you can say, now it's your turn to help tell the story, because that can create a really cool end of semester project where the students make an EscapeIF game based on what they've been learning thus far, set in the world that you've helped to create. So I like to think about how do we make something playful? So this game about fractions, so I put it on feeding animals. So you could make it like recipes. That's a pretty traditional fraction-based tool is you have a recipe for 4, you have 6 people, use fractions to figure that out. But it's more playful if it's like zoo animals. Oh, well, you've got to feed zoo animals. So that's kind of exciting. And now even more playful is like dinosaurs. Now you're feeding dinosaurs. But it's important that you don't stray too far, so that because in the reflection, you want to help the students tie what they did back to the real world settings. And you do that through a series of leading questions that we'll talk about later. The genre, you want to, as you're starting to make the game, you want to think if this were a movie or TV show, would it be a mystery? Would it be an adventure? Would it be a romantic comedy? That's going to be a little weird, but you could do it. What would be the genre? Because thinking about the genre helps you think about the story. It helps to set the groundwork of what's going to go on. It helps to set the groundwork for who the players are, what's their role. We use a concept when we talk about game design about roles and goals, that you want the players to have a role and they're going to have a goal. Now that role and goal will be set by the genre. If this is a mystery, I may be an investigator trying to figure things out. If it's an adventure, I may be just trying to get away from whatever's going on. So figure out your roles and your goals for your player. Who are they in the story world? And then you want to think about, well, who's the bad guy? What's creating the obstacles? Games are about having obstacles to overcome. That's why we play a game. We play a game because we want to make our lives a little bit more difficult. If you think about it, that's what games are. Games are like, hey, why don't you make my life a little harder? And I'm going to have fun trying to overcome some obstacles. So as the game designer, you have to think about, why are those obstacles there? I've got a whole series of papers called Ask Why for escape room design, which is about making sure that your stuff makes sense. You don't put a laser maze in a pyramid in Egypt just because. No, you want to think about who put that laser maze there. Why is it there? What's going on in the story? And that's what you have to think about in your story world. Who has put those obstacles, or is it nature that's put those obstacles in the way? Is it just the way things are? What's created the obstacles? And it's always important to have an ally for the players. Who's the good guy? Who's the person? Because the ally is going to start the players off on their journey. There's a little thing called the hero's journey, which can be useful if you've never seen it as a tool in helping you make these. And you want to give the players an ally. And most of the time, the ally is going to be role played by the teacher as a way to give the students information, assistance, and advice. Now you want to think about your story beats. By the way, what I'm presenting right now is the really high level of a whole semester-long class I teach on this concept. So now you're at the midterms. Hopefully you've studied, because I'm going to give you a quiz. So you want to create story beats. Now, story beats are the major things in the story. You can turn to the 3-act structure. This is the structure I use to make a one-class game, about a 40-minute game. I use 3 major story beats, and I use the 3-act structure. Act 1 is where the players learn about who they are, and there's some kind of conflict they're introduced to. So they find out what they're up against. Act 2, they start to resolve the conflict, but then there's a twist. Something changes to make it interesting. Act 3, the players engage with the twist and are able to resolve the original conflict. And that's it. Those are your 3 major story beats. The players encounter the conflict, something changes, and then they're able to resolve that conflict. And that makes a 3-act story. That makes a 40-minute game, are 3 major things. And to apply those to learning outcomes, so in Act 1, you're applying the learning outcome in a simple way to learn the basic methods. You're learning the basics of perimeter and area. In Act 2, you do a more complex version. So in Act 2, it might be, now you can make a round pen, figure that out. Now you can make a 2-dimensional pen, figure that out. That would add a twist to make things more interesting. And then Act 3 is, now they're going to take those concepts and apply it in a different situation. So those are the 3 ways you apply the learning outcomes: basic concepts, more complex concepts, apply it in a different situation. And again, if you're like, whoa, Scott, way too much too fast, go to the video. I've got 2 hours. I take you through this whole process with the worksheet, let you pause, and you can work it all out. And I'll give you that link at the end. Challenges. Now, challenges are how you're going to bring in those learning outcomes. And the challenges are how you convey the story beats. So you have a story beat, you say, all right, I want the players to do this story element. How do I have a challenge that supports it? Many times in making bad educational games, they do it the other way. They say, oh, we want to do this math thing. Now we need a challenge to support it. You know, we need to have the person think about past participles. All right, we'll have the pumpkin head ask them a past participle. No, don't do that. Start with your story world and your narrative, and then have the challenge be what conveys the narrative. It helps convey the story. How can the challenge help the players either understand their role or understand the world or move forward in the story? But make sure the challenge matters. The players are more invested if they feel like what they're doing makes a difference and it's not just wasting their time. So when you make a challenge, what you want to think about is, what are the things I have to work with in the story world? So if I'm making a dinosaur safari story world, well, what do I have to work with? Well, I have pens, I have fencing, I have the sizes of dinosaurs. These are all called affordances when you're doing game design, because they're things that your environment provides to you to make a more embedded and natural game. And when you make your challenge, you've got to think about, where are the players at the start? How will they know that they're done? And how do they get there? And the getting there is where the learning outcome comes into place. That's your verb, your activity is the learning outcome that helps the players get from the start to the finish. And when they're at the finish, they've engaged with that story beat. So you do this 3 times for a 40-minute one classroom game. 3 challenges is the way I like to do it. Then you need to round out that narrative. So I like to have like an opening choice like we did today, wood or metal fence. Some little simple opening choice just to get the players engaged a little bit. You could have additional choices to help connect the dots or to help introduce affordances. So that wood and metal introduced an affordance of wood and metal fencing that later on I can use in my puzzle design. But I don't have to come up with that at the beginning. I come up with my story beats, my challenges, and then say, okay, for this challenge to make sense at the end, I need to make sure the players have thought about this, and I put those in as choices. I also like to put in an optional physical activity because escape games have physical elements. So it might be you have to go find dinosaur eggs, and they're these rocks, and they're hidden in the classroom already. You have 3 minutes to find as many as you can, go. Or I've done it where this dinosaur has gotten out of his pen, but he's scared very easily. You have 1 minute to hide somewhere in the classroom, and I'm gonna be the dinosaur and walking around, and I shouldn't see you, go. Something, but when I write these into games, I always make them optional, but it's nice to have a break midway to have something physical to get the players to shake up their brain, and then they come back and they're more engaged in what's going on. You then draw a map of all of how your encounters all come together. So you have your onboarding activity, your first challenge, maybe you offer them an item, do you want this or not? Then an Act 2 challenge with the twist. Maybe there's a choice of paths. Do you go to path A or path B? Then maybe in a physical activity, check to see if the player has the item, and that takes them to 1 challenge if they do, 1 challenge if they don't, and then their end reflection. And this is useful to draw out at this point because it's then going to help you write out the script, because then you're ready to write the script because you know paragraph 1, that's your first box. It leads to paragraph 2 or paragraph 3. So that's the tools that you use to put this all together. Finally, the reflection. The reflection is the most important part of what you're doing. Because you only learn when you do something and reflect upon it. So I say for a 1-hour class, you want 40 minutes of gameplay and 20 minutes for administration and reflection. So I say about you want to have 2/3 game time and 1/3 reflection time. And you lead them through a series of questions. You ask them, all right, what did you do with area and perimeter in the game? Then, how might you use those concepts in the real world? Or in what careers might someone need to use that? Or when might your parents need to use that? The goal of the reflection is to help them make that connection between that learning outcome and why they're learning that thing, that real world connection. And I like to build that reflection into the game if I can, where you have the ally lead the players into the reflection. I love to use ethical reflections where you think about the ethics of what you're doing. So I made one game about dinosaurs where they had to decide if they were going to give the dinosaurs some drugs to help them live longer, but what is the implication of that? And thinking about ethical treatment of animals and ethical treatment of zoos. And so you can get into that during these reflections as well. Play testing is also needed. You can't just make the game and run it. Your game will break. Your game will be too hard and it will take too long. Those are the 2 things I always see with puzzle-based games, because when you make a puzzle-based game, you have everything in your mind. The players don't. The players have an incomplete view of the situation. So play testing is essential. Now, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to give you a brief challenge to see how you do with this. So I want you to think about the learning outcome of the zone of proximal development. So you're all in learning. Hopefully you've seen this before. It's the idea that the difference when you're teaching someone something, that there's an area, a circle around them where they can learn stuff, and a bit further out, they can't learn anything. So you want to teach the concept of ZPD, of the zone of proximal development. And I want your goal is to think about what is a story world where you could have an analogy to ZPD. So what I want you to come up with is, I'm going to put you in small groups again for a few minutes. What's a story world where this might work? So like in my case, story world is dinosaur safari. That's all we're looking for. What's the role of the player? The player is a caretaker of the dinosaurs. What's a challenge that they'll face where they'll have to do something that then you can create in the reflection and aha to say, oh, that's just like ZPD. That's just like how the zone of proximal development works. So I'm going to put you in groups again. Again, you want to think about what's the story world, who's the player, what's one thing they're going to do, and how does the thing they do connect back to the aha on what ZPD is. So I'm going to throw you in groups for a few minutes and we'll see what you come up with. So let's go breakout rooms. We're going to do recreate. We're going to create fewer because you'll have bigger groups, and go. Okay. So welcome back. What I'd like you to do now is, if you would, type in the chat the 1-sentence pitch for your game idea. So my case would be like, the player is a caretaker of dinosaurs and a dinosaur safari, and we'll be building a new pen. Write out your 1-sentence pitch that you came up with.
We've just got 4 minutes left, Scott, just to give you a
This
heads
is
up.
our last thing. And I always start with the story world, because once you get a good story world, it's so much easier to make everything fit in and make sense. If you just have a series of random puzzles, then it's hard to come back and build a story. And that's how we get bad educational games. So yeah, these are great. Look at all these cool ideas. The player's a dog trainer, and an otter training camp to build up fitness level. These are all fantastic. You could see, you could take any one of these and make a playful game out of it. You can see how with the story world first, the game comes to life, not, oh, we're going to make a game about ZPD. That sounds awesome, Scott. So that's why I put stories in your games, but start with the stories. If you want to keep up or get more involved with EscapeIF, EscapeIF.com, that's your website. You're going to find sample games. You'll find my 2-hour video workshop on how to make a game. The game repository link is over at the M Education Alliance. I've got the link for that. And where we are going next is we're looking to get funding to create a student-friendly version of the workshop, so that you as a teacher can then have your students make these games at the end of class. You can see how that the students, once they've played some games, then you say, now you're going to create the next chapter in the story, and you have each student group make one challenge, and then you knit that all together into a bigger story. So that is my presentation. We have a couple minutes left for any questions that people may have or comments, and then that will be it for me.
Great, thanks very much, Scott. So if you have any questions, you can either unmute or we can post them in the chat. Thank you, Kenji, for posting the links. It's really good. I have so many tabs open now. Any other questions? Just a reminder, if you do think of some questions or thoughts on Scott's presentation, of course, we do have our interactive Padlet wall, which is open throughout the day, so you can always post on there as well. But I think we'll all agree that was a really inspiring talk, and I just want to go and plan the game now for my students. So
any way that we can make games more accessible to people and get away from focusing on the tech, and I saw this post earlier in an earlier session, focus on the design. You could always, here's the next aha, if you've heard of something called Twine, you could take everything that you've just made and now make a Twine game out of it. Because all the concepts of making a branching narrative teach students how to write a computer program. So this does it at a much lower barrier level. And then you're like, hey, now you learned how to do if-then statements. You learned how to do variables. You learned how to do branches. Now I'm going to show you Twine. Now you're going to make a digital game. So it sets the groundwork at a better level for students. Rather than focusing on the tools, they focus on the stories that they want to tell.
Indeed, indeed. Was there a question? I thought I saw a hand up, but I can't see on my screen who it was. Is there any question?
So with an older audience, to be honest, I find with older audiences, many times I'll just go in with the playful approach I have. You know, I mean, yes, you could be like, you could say, we're going to run a zoo instead of a dinosaur safari, but I find we've been using simulations for decades. This is just a simulation. So you can just figure out how close to reality you need to have that simulation to make it work. But adults can play too when they're given permission to do so.
Absolutely. And on that note, thank you very much, Scott, for your presentation. And we will, on the stroke of 4 o'clock, we will move to our second workshop for today. And our second workshop is being presented by Nancy Winfrey, who is joining us from North Carolina. Hello, Nancy.
Good morning for me. Good afternoon.
Good evening from us.
Any number of greetings, but hello. I should just go with hello.
Hello. So And Nancy's going to talk to us today about designing for active learning, a simple framework for engaging students. So I will hand over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm glad to be here, and thank you, Scott. That was really interesting. Workshop about gaming. It sounds like a project I would love to get into and which would take over a bit of my life. But I hope to have a space of time to think about it some more. So thank you so much. I'm going to put in the chat box a link to a Google Doc, which is a handout that would be useful during the workshop if you want to access that. And I'm also going to share my screen here. And I'll just let you know that I'm not great about monitoring the chat and talking and moving slides and everything else. So
I can keep an eye on the chat. And,
thank you. Feel free to just interrupt with a question or a comment. For those of you who would like to know the big picture, this is a bit of an interactive workshop. So I'll be asking you for some participation in this large group, and then also in some breakout rooms towards the end there. So just to warn you that those requests are coming. So we're talking about a simple framework, and it is indeed very simple, and I've used it a great deal over a number of years, and I'm a fan. Just by way of introduction, I am a faculty developer at North Carolina A&T State University, and I work at the Center for Teaching Excellence. So I work with faculty. And as Scott said, absolutely adults can have fun. And one of my mantras is no laughter, no learning. So I'm all about having a little fun in the midst of some rigorous learning. So I expect faculty, although it's not always easy to get folks to turn their camera on, let alone engage and have a good time, right? It's the ongoing challenge, but we're up for it. So let's just get started on this topic here of this framework. Maybe you've heard this statement, telling isn't teaching, isn't necessarily teaching. You know, you can say to your students things that are very important. Two angles are complementary if the sum of their measure is 90 degrees. But we all know that just saying something to our students, even if it's in a well-crafted lecture, doesn't necessarily mean that they've been taught. Another way to think about the same concept is from the other side, listening isn't necessarily learning. So passively received information isn't guaranteed to be retrieved later when you're asked your students on a quiz or in a conversation or in some application task, you know, to have the information they need to do the task. Harvard physics professor Eric Mazur says, the lecture method is a process whereby the lecture notes of the instructor get transferred to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. It's so funny. Dr. Mazur is brilliant, and he's also a funny guy. And I recommend his evidence-based work on lecture combined with peer instruction. That's been a focus of a lot of his teaching research and publications. And it kind of goes along with the premise I have here, which is simply telling students something does not equal learning. It's not necessarily good teaching, and it's not necessarily fruitful learning. So what I want to talk about today is how to keep information from just passing through the brain or bypassing the brain altogether of our students by designing our teaching time such that we're working in harmony with how our brains were created to function. So that's where we're going here. Thanks to MRI imaging, we know a lot about the brain and the path of learning through our brain. So like all nervous systems, the human brain, just like the brains of small animals really, is busy sensing, taking in information and stimulus from external sources and from within your own body, and integrating that information and responding to it and moving. That description and this visual are highly oversimplified, but I think it's going to serve our purpose today. So this is actually the part of your brain in the back here where sensory input comes into the brain. And that input moves into the temporal integrative cortex, and then to the frontal integrative cortex, and finally to the premotor and motor part of your brain, before it turns into output, some action. And that, of course, creates new stimulus, and the cycle just repeats. Of course, it can happen just like that, or it can be a longer process. So if we want to work with the brain, and from this perspective of teaching and learning, we might simply label the process something like this. So sensing is, you just had some kind of experience. And the temporal integrative cortex is the place where you're thinking about it, you're reflecting on it, you're having conversations about it. The frontal integrative cortex is where you figured it out. You come up with a hypothesis, you contextualize, you have some way to work with the concept, and then you in fact do that work. You try out your new idea, you take action, and you've created a new input. So the main point here is that the brain is designed to direct the body. The purpose of thinking is to tell the body what to do next. So the brain is designed for action. So on your handout on the front page there is this very same drawing of the brain. And so what I want to ask you to do is take a minute and think about a learning experience that you've had, a recent one or a memorable one, and see if you can trace that learning experience that you had through these 4 steps of the brain process. And I'm going to give you a minute of silence to think about that. But before I start the little timer, what are your questions about what I'm asking you to do? Okay, I will take that as we're good. And I'm just going to... Well, that was 1 minute, and maybe you just needed a minute of peace and quiet. And I'm happy to have provided that for you. But for those of you who actually were thinking about your brain and a learning experience, does someone want to share something that they came up with? Okay, well, we'll just move right on. So back in 1974, when David Kolb created what's now a well-known model for experiential learning, he didn't have the advantages of neuroscience to support his theory, but look at this: concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active testing. So those are the 4 parts of Kolb's learning theory, and they line up exactly with what's going on in our brain at the same time. So the thing, though, that we want to keep coming back to, and Kolb says, learning originates in concrete experience from his model, but experience is not the whole thing. If the experience is listening, hearing some information like a lecture, then we know that listening in and of itself doesn't guarantee learning. So in fact, it's only the beginning, right? Because learning depends on reflection, conceptualization, and active testing. So what we want is an intentional approach to teaching that moves with the natural functionality of the brain. And this design framework does that in just 4 simple steps. So let's look at these 4 steps. The first one is an anchor, tapping into prior knowledge or experience. Just like it sounds, an anchor, a place to hold, a place to start. It works as a connector between information the student already has and new content that you're going to add. You can use it in terms of assessing prior knowledge, like getting connected to what students already know about a topic, or making a link from something they do know about that's familiar enough that you can build a bridge to the new content that you want to add. It can also be like a hook, you know, to get some buy-in, generate some interest in what you want them to learn here in just a minute. But, you know, in your brain, dendrites are always forming and looking to connect to existing dendrites. And those form new neuronal pathways in your brain. And those pathways are what students need for retrieval later on. So you want to help out those dendrites and get them places that they can start to connect. If anybody in here is like a scientist, I'm sorry, I am not. So this is like brain science for dummies here, but I think it's just enough to make the point of the importance of designing our teaching and learning at any rate. Okay, so the next step is add, and that's just introducing new content. So new experience, new information, something that aligns with your course goals for the day. And then we need to apply, like right then and right there. Instead of sending students home with homework where they make application and they're grappling with a new formula or a new equation or some concept, have them do that work right there, right then in class, because they have the benefit of you as instructor number 1 and their peers to answer questions. And you can correct misinformation, you can help make pertinent connections, you can help them from getting stuck right away. So you're having them work with the content right there in class. And then the last step is away. And that doesn't mean a takeaway like a handout. It means, how does this new knowledge, this new experience, this new learning transfer from your classroom setting to where students are going to actually really need it? So in the real world, in tomorrow's class, in the next unit, in the next semester, whatever. But what you want to do is make connections. How is this information really relevant in the big picture of what we're learning in this course, or in the discipline, or in the field? How is it foundational to the next content piece? How can you apply this in a totally alternative setting where you might find yourself later on? So it's being intentional about transfer of learning from the classroom to wherever this learning is actually needed, because you know, class is not the real world, it's preparation for what's going on out there. So we want to help make that connection for our students. So there you go. Our overview of the brain, Kolb's model of experiential learning, and this 4-step design framework, it's all congruent. And I know from years of using it that it's useful, and regardless of content. And it consistently ensures that students in the class time are going to go through a complete learning cycle every time with every learning objective. And as an added bonus, each step starts with the letter A, so it's easy to remember. Anchor, add, apply, away. So if this high level exploration of the biology of learning is interesting to you, I borrowed heavily from James Zoll and The Art of Changing the Brain, and I highly recommend his book, and it's referenced at the end of the handout. And the design idea comes from Jane Valla and her dialogue education work, and it's a small piece of her elaborate design system, and it's called a learning task in her big setup. But it's just a way to design time in a classroom or in a workshop or anywhere else, so that whatever you're teaching has a better chance of actually being learned. So her work is in the handout as well. So This design framework is like a roadmap for the unfolding of your learning objective, and it works in any of the major learning domains. It's infinitely useful. So if it's a cognitive learning task, knowledge, if it's psychomotor, skill or behavior, or even if it's in the affective learning domain, like emotion or attitudinal change, you can use this design framework. And if you believe that the brain is indeed designed for action, that's what I'm selling today, you'll need an achievement-based objective and strong and rigorous verbs. I recommend Bloom's revised taxonomy, and there's some information about that in your handout as well. But to keep it handy for ideas, I'm needing ideas as I choose more complex or higher level functioning. I want verbs that are aligned with a higher level. And all you have to do is just look at the list and you get all kinds of really great ideas. So I'm going to also suggest that when you think about learning objectives, think about writing them in the future perfect tense. And here's an example. By the end of this class, students will have identified the sections of a research journal article and evaluated the summary provided by the authors. So the difference and the rationale is this. By the end of this session, students will be able to blah, blah, blah. Well, I would say, how do you know they're able to blah, blah, blah? And how do they know that they're able to? So how can you measure something if it's not really specific? I mean, if you're finding out if they're able to or not at exam time, that could be bad for everybody. So what you want to do is sequence learning and have formative assessments along the way and feedback so the students are in fact being prepared for whatever their final grading system is going to be. So if you have these kind of specific learning objectives, and by the end of the session, they will have achieved them because it's built into the design. You're not hoping they know about it, they will have done it because that's how you designed the task where they identify these sections and they evaluate the summary. So anyway, you're going to know right there and there in class that they are understanding and using the material, and they're going to know themselves. So that's confidence building for the students, and gives you a lot of information. You can see where they're getting hung up, where they're moving more quickly than you expected, those kinds of things. Okay, so let's practice. Here is our learning objective from the cognitive domain. So we're talking about knowledge. By the end of this session, participants will have chosen the healthiest ingredients for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's very common in the US. So if that's, not your childhood sandwich, just replace in your imagination, a falafel sandwich or whatever you like. And of course, you would tailor this to your audience, right? So I'm going to just provide an example, and then we're going to do some work on it ourselves. So we're in the cognitive domain. We're talking about knowledge. So I'm thinking as an anchor. Okay, I might ask my students, everybody take a minute and go back in your mind to your childhood peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. What were the ingredients and when did you eat them? Or what did you like about them? Or what did you not like about them? And if somebody's never had that or doesn't know what it is, you can ask them to picture whatever their favorite sandwich was as a child. But anyway, what I want them to do is do some reflection, and I'm looking for an anchor, right? I'm looking for somewhere where they already have information about PB&Js in their brain, a feeling, a remembrance, something to connect to. So now I'm going to add some information. So I'm going to say, okay, here is a template. Here's a chart, or make a chart, or here's a handout, with a template on it, and have a column for peanut butter, and a column for jelly, and a column for bread. Okay, so put in your childhood brands first. Oh, my grandma always used Jif peanut butter, so put Jif. Creamy, yeah, it has to be creamy. Put the things in there. Maybe they don't remember the brands, that's fine. What kind of jelly? Or was it jam? Or was it marmalade? And that sort of thing. Anyway, you're just getting them to get that information out on the piece of paper. And so now what they need to do is pull out that smartphone or the one that's on their desk already and they've been glancing at, right? Put those things to work and get online and do a little research. Okay, look up the nutritional information for your childhood PB&J ingredients and write that on your paper and look at the numbers. And then look up some other brands and get those nutritional facts and then start making some comparisons. So use the handout that you've prepared for them to collect all this information, all this data, and then make some judgments about it. So actually what I'm doing for the ad, I'm having them generate the content. So that's another way to do it. So a fun application would be go to the grocery store, get these ingredients and make a sandwich, right? But you can't really do that in the classroom. But what you could do, because the learning objective is making healthy choices, not how do you make a sandwich, right? So in the classroom, they could certainly choose from their lists alternative and more healthy, more nutritious brands of peanut butter and jelly and bread, and then write out that recipe for the new sandwich that includes the rationale for the choices that they've made from a nutritional perspective. And so, and there you have it. Now the away might be to take the process, because what they're learning is the process of making healthy choices, right? So take that process out of the classroom and take it back home. And so maybe you'd assign homework that says, go in the pantry at your home and find something on the shelf that you love to eat and that you routinely eat, and go through the same process. Look up the nutritional information, see if you can improve on that, and so on. And then turn in, that's your homework. I've turned that in class next week. So anchor, add, apply, away. What I want us to do for about 10 minutes here is give you guys a chance in small groups to work on that same process, to practice. And so here are two more achievement-based learning objectives, one from the psychomotor domain, one from the affective domain. You can pick whichever one you like or do both. This information is also in the handout, so you can remember what the learning objectives were and what the 4 pieces of the design are. I'm going to open up breakout rooms for 3 people per room for 10 minutes. But before I do that and set the timer, what are your questions about what I'm asking you to do? Okay, well, here's your invitation to a breakout room, and I'll see you back here in 10 minutes.
I don't think the breakout room invites have come up.
Oh, it says they're open. It says in progress.
Yep, the invite's
yes.
out. You haven't got one, Wendy.
Yeah. That's it, yeah.
I see people in rooms.
Yes, no, okay. I can see them now. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I think you can go to anyone you want to, Wendy. You should be able to.
Yeah, if you're the host, yeah.
Oh, this is quite a good breakout room here, actually. I was just going to say, Nancy, I was just talking about this in the chat, that the idea of anchoring, I think, is just so important as an initial step, because there's something in psychology, you probably have heard of the foot in the door effect. Once you get that first initial agreement to purchase something, then it's much harder for participants to back out if you try and increase the level of investment. So we've been doing some work on essay writing and report writing with students, and using the anchor as like a way of getting that initial investment. So, you draw on their experience. Mm-hmm. They feel that they've participated or engaged a little. And then once they've done that, the next step, when you start sort of looking at the next step, they've already made that initial commitment to the task. So it's much harder for them to sort of sit back and not engage. Or so yeah, I think the anchor is just so important as an initial step. Yeah, interesting type thing.
And I do like that it's bridging who they are or where they are or what they know to something new. So it's not intimidating. You know, it builds a little bit of confidence. Just a lot of layers of usefulness around the idea of anchoring.
Definitely. And also just that it's not possible to get it wrong. You know, strips away that fear of sort of giving a wrong answer, really. You're drawing on their experience.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's not a right or wrong. It's very inviting or, non-threatening. Anyway, yes, I agree.
Oh, hello, Sarah. Just seen your message in the chat. That's fine. Did you want to go into a different room, or are you happy to stay in the main room? Shout if you want to.
That's all right. I can stay here.
Grand.
Oh, sorry. I could stay here.
That's fine. Just checking. There was a lot of discussion, Nancy, about whether jelly is the same thing as jam in the UK. In the chat.
No, it's not the same thing. Well, I was going to use this time to catch up with the chat, but I see that there's nothing there. So that's, oh, you know what? The top of my thing said, thank you, Scott. And so I thought, oh, okay, no chat. So maybe I should look at this for a minute. Okay, there's some really good comments here. We have a minute. I think it's important that I address the jelly and jam comment.
I think that's vital.
Oh, I like this a lot. I have to speak to this. Should. That's a great comment. Okay, Scott has answered the jam and jelly. Okay.
quite an interesting comment, just looking at Andrew's comment about the risk-free investment in terms of these sorts of tasks that students can engage in. But that idea of being risk averse, I think, is quite an interesting one. Do we just create risk-free tasks, or do we encourage students to be bold and take a risk? I don't know.
Right. Well, if your anchor is risk-free, that's a good sequence, right? So you're getting students engaged when there's no stake. It's low or no stakes, right?
Yeah.
Application, there's a time for them to stretch a bit.
Yeah, so the risk comes later in the process rather than initially, I guess.
Yes, I'm a fan. Jane Bella is actually my mentor at this point, a very dear friend. She's 90 years old. I see her routinely, but she's written extensively on her whole design system. And I recommend all of her work. But this particular piece you can pull out and apply in a lot of different ways. And so this is my teaser for the work of Jane and dialogue education. It's interesting. There's no end of publications that she has. She can
Just while we're waiting, if you did want to start an active learning group, a satellite group at your institution, that would be fantastic. But I'll leave you to have a think about that. We've got it on our Padlet wall for today.
Okay.
The information, but we meet every month with the satellite group leads, and we just plot and plan all sorts of exciting events and projects. And
I would love to do that.
Yeah,
fact,
that would be brilliant.
To be honest, I'm actually moving. I started a new job. So that's not what's left out of my introduction, but actually I'm assistant director of a program for leadership and character in the professional schools at a different university. So yeah, that's very exciting.
Sounds exciting. Yeah.
So it's law school, medical school, divinity school, and interdisciplinary studies. And I'm the curriculum and pedagogy person for that. So I actually have no idea exactly what I'm going to be doing.
Well, that's even more exciting. Well, congratulations. That sounds really exciting.
But yes, I'd love to do that. How do I connect?
So, I mean, I can send you the information about the next meeting. So, I mean, I've got your contact details. So, yeah, basically, if I send you those, you'll see we have like a Google Doc, which is our rolling agenda, and you can add things to that, and you can get involved in any of the different projects. And yeah, we basically meet once a month, and just if you can't make it, doesn't matter, you've got the Google Doc, you can jump on and have a look at what was discussed and contribute to that. But yeah, I'll send you the information anyway about the next one.
Thank you, I'd love that. Yes, I feel like I'm just infinitely advocating for active learning, like
it's music to my ears.
In higher ed, it's just, and thankfully I'm moving from STEM research focused institution where, oh my gosh, I mean, every workshop, everything we do with faculty, we start with a really strong research-based rationale for whatever little thing it is we're asking them to do, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm moving to a smaller private institution, and it's more liberal arts focused, and so I'm thinking, oh gosh.
Oh, that would be nice.
It will.
That would be nice.
So I think we're all here, yeah?
I think so.
Close enough anyway. So does anyone want to give a brief reporting of the work they did, as in brief, just give us a taste?
Our group dealt with the teaching how to construct a secure knot for shoelaces. So we were, we had lots of discussion about what the anchor could be. We're assuming this is maybe some young children. So just looking at the challenges that they might have in terms of actually being able to tie a knot. And then, in the sort of, so that was the anchor part. The add part, I mean, my contribution was the way that my children have learned to tie their shoelaces is to use the bunny ears method to tie the shoelace. Then they would actually apply that knowledge by physically tying a shoelace. And then the away was that perhaps they could learn about other knots, other ways of tying knots. And some challenges that we thought was that we could ask the children just to tie a knot. Technically, any knot could be secure, but the challenge is knowing how to do a knot that you can untie at the end. And that could be sort of dealt with in the adding and applying stage of the design framework.
Great. Sounds good to me. This design framework is really simple, but it's infinitely useful. And so I do like when we use this with faculty, even having practice sessions on topics that are peanut butter and jelly, tying your shoes, to keep them out of taking a deep dive into the nuances of their discipline. Just make it simple so they can learn process. And then when the process is solid, then they can contextualize for whatever it is that they're teaching. So it might have been a while since some of us have thought about even how to tie a shoelace, right? But any of your creative kind of learning activities can fit within this framework. And you just simply repeat the structure with new content. And structure supports creative and critical thinking because you're helping students focus on a specific task with clear directions and in a sequence that reflects the natural learning cycle of their brains. So if you think about it, structure equals safety, because everyone knows what to expect, and then safety supports increased student engagement. At our Center for Teaching Excellence, we use this structure with our faculty to frame our faculty development workshops too. And so as a result, I can see by virtue of going through this process, whether faculty are able to incorporate these ideas or concepts or whatever it is into their classrooms. And because there's interaction, there's dialogue among colleagues, which is sometimes lacking in higher ed. And so there's a lot that can be learned from working on these things in some dialogue. So I do have a Padlet board for some reflective contextualization, but we might just want to chat here for our last 5 minutes together. I do want to say that this workshop follows the design, and this would be the away piece of it right here using this Padlet board. I can put the link in the chat if folks are interested in that. I do want to briefly, though, wrap up some of the comments in the chat box once I had a chance to look at it. Thankfully, Scott, I think, addressed the jam jelly conversation, and he did so correctly as far as I know. This idea about steps in active learning and what happens when, I think, the whole neuroscience bit of this was super simplified. I think it's accurate, but it's very simplified. And active learning is a process, really, and it's a brain process. It doesn't mean that you've gotten out of your desk and moved across the room. Of course, movement is good for learning, right? But active learning, what's active is your brain. And so we want to make sure we get through the whole loop of what the brain is designed to do for learning to be as efficient and as productive as possible. And I really like this brief conversation about learning objectives and whether everybody should be expected to learn something, and that will have learned it does sound prescriptive. I think where the space is and will have is that I'm designing my class so that everyone will have the opportunity to have participated in the whole cycle. Now, the degree to which they participate and what they learn and how and when they learn it, then that's very idiosyncratic. So I set the conditions, and there's equitable conditions, and students are working together, and I'm in the room observing, but how much everybody, the energy each student gives is their choice, and I cannot control that. So there are always folks who don't want to do anything you ask them, and there are folks who are overachievers, and there's everybody in the middle. What I do is set evidence-based, consistent situation in the room, and I facilitate it to the best of my ability, and I just hope for the best, right? And then it's up to students because to invest in their own learning and apply themselves to the fullest degree that's been made available to them. And isn't that the whole challenge of teaching and learning anyway? How do you get that kind of a response? So we have 4 minutes or so to for conversation or for questions.
So you can either unmute or you can just post in the chat if you have any questions for Nancy in the last couple of minutes.
I can put the Padlet board in here if anyone.
I can just chime in here briefly. I just want to see that how does this correlates to the Bloom's taxonomy? If you can maybe shed some light on that.
Sure. Well, the taxonomy is a categorization of levels of cognitive processing. And then for each level, what are verbs that would engage students to that level with some kind of learning task. So it's a resource. You do need foundational processing, like remembering. There is some memorization. You can't ask students to connect the dots if they don't have dots to connect, right? So that's not to say that the foundational levels aren't important, they are, but you want to sequence over the course of the semester broadly, and over the course of a course, a class, or a unit as well, that they are moving towards more complex processing. And so the verb list and the categorization is just a way to help us think as we design our class time. Am I pushing students enough? What kind of application? If I'm doing application, what are some other tasks that they could do? What would be more creative? To me, it's a resource for ideas. If I really want them to engage at a certain level. So for example, we're doing application and I look on Bloom's taxonomy and there's solve, use, demonstrate, operate, schedule, sketch. I'm like, oh, sketch. Okay, let's do a graphic organizer. Okay, let's do a mind map. Okay, and so I get ideas, and I can see that where I am on the pyramid is just a resource.
Grand, I think there's one more question we can squeeze in here, which is from Beth. Do you make any of this explicit to students, and does that help?
Sometimes. I think, if I'm teaching the whole semester, they get the hang of it before too long, because they know a lot of what to expect. And not that every class time, you can make loops, you can, anchor something, you can add, you can apply it, you can add more, you can apply it, you can add more, and apply it in a way. And it would be naive to think that every single class time is exactly follows these 4 steps. But in general, and certainly broadly, I try to incorporate those things. Maybe if it's a hybrid or a flipped class, some of that might happen before class. Some of it might happen after class. So, but I think with faculty, we very often in a workshop will unpack the workshop. If it's on this topic, we at the end unpack it, and I ask them to do that. Okay, we've just used this framework to design the workshop. Where do you see these 4 things? So that they see the usefulness of it from their own experience, not just me telling them, but they have experienced a workshop based on this design. So that's just added rationale when I'm trying to sell this idea to faculty. But I think depending on the topic or the time or the place in the semester or any number of variables, yeah, I think it's good for students to understand how the brain functions, because we want them to be self-directed learners. And if they can start understanding how to support their own learning in ways, I think that'd be really useful just in general, beyond your particular class.
Grand. Well, thank you very much, Nancy. If you do have any other questions for Nancy, remember our Padlet wall is still up and running. Sarah has just posted the link for the final session in the chat, which is taking place in just a couple of moments. So thank you once again to both of our presenters today, to Scott and to Nancy, and hopefully see you all in the final session of the day. So thank you very much once again, and see you all very soon.
Thank you.